Welcome to Elemental Energy, the podcast where we discuss how to simplify decarbonization. Here, we will introduce emerging low-carbon energy technologies and give you insight on how to navigate and support the evolving energy landscape. It is our goal to develop content to give you confidence to help transition the market and make low-carbon energy reliable and affordable. I'm your host, Marcia Leonard. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about offshore wind, specifically in the United States. And we're going to talk about why a lot of the recent projects along the East Coast have been canceled, which really blows, in my opinion. So I'm joined today by Dane Pearman, who has been in this industry for quite some time, and he is going to be able to speak much more intelligently to the current status and market of offshore wind. So Dane, welcome to Elemental Energy.
Great. Thanks, Marcia. It's great to be here. I think your epitaph of how you described that was perfect for the topic about wind and blowing. So, yeah.
So Dane, please go ahead and introduce yourself further so everybody knows who we're talking with.
Sure. So my name is Dane Pearman. I work for a consulting firm called Worley. Right now, I am our lead for offshore wind energy development in the United States. I've been in the industry for about 10 years, kind of really involved in a lot of the projects on the permitting end and the front end of the process. So really gotten to know a number of different offshore wind developers and a lot of their permitting staff, a lot of their engineering staff, as well as other leaders in the market. So people from the finance side, people from the insurance side, people in the supply chain side. So I live in New Jersey, outside of Philadelphia. New Jersey right now is kind of ground zero for offshore wind. There's a lot of project activity off the New Jersey coast. There's a lot of demand load for offshore wind energy in New Jersey and in New York in particular. There's a lot of politics associated with offshore wind. So while I like to stay on the science, it's kind of always lurking in the background is that there's a lot of political engagement on offshore wind on both sides of the fence. So I try to rise above that and stay in the technical. But when there's misinformation, I feel one of the things I need to do is correct misinformation when it's scientifically misinforming. So that's sort of my background.
Yeah, well, I think it's amazing how much politics are having a play in the energy space. I mean, as I've progressed through my career, I've come to learn that politics and energy go hand in hand, and you have to be studied in both in order to help make movements in the space. So, Dane, tell us a fun fact about yourself.
A fun fact. I'm a musician, and I think you can probably see my guitar behind me. So I'm a musician, and one of the wonderful things that I've been able to do is kind of combine my music and my place in the offshore wind market. So fun fact that many of the listeners might know is that at the two big US conferences every year, I am in a band called Making Wind. We are all industry professionals. There's 4 of us to 5 of us, depending on time, and we play a concert at each of these conferences, every 6 months or so at the ACP, American Clean Power Conference, and at Oceanic Network International Partnering Forum. So this year, I think we're going to be playing at the House of Blues in New Orleans in April. And it's a fun time. I mean, we're not great, but we are fun. So at a conference, it's a perfect environment for people that just want to have fun. We're not overpowering, so they can have great conversations and listen to adequate music all at the same time. We bring guest people up, so other people in the industry. Last year, we brought Spencer Haynes, who is a person with Duke Energy, came up and played harmonica with us. So it's just always fun. It's very loose and casual, and it's kind of perfect for like building camaraderie in the market. So yeah, I got to put it all together and have fun doing it.
How contrasting would this be is for your band Making Wind to learn how to play classical gas.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that.
Well, kudos for you of knowing what classical gas is. So
I love that. That is so cool. Okay, I'm glad I asked that question. All right, Dane, let's jump into the current market of offshore wind, but please do us a favor and help us kind of understand the history around building up offshore wind here in the United States, like when it kicked in, because I remember working heavily in 2022 on the feasibility and environmental side of things to try and get ready for this influx, but just help our audience understand a history of how it's progressed here and then landing on where we're at currently, please.
Yeah, so it's been a little bit of a rocky road in the United States for a number of different reasons, not so much related to the technical. Offshore wind actually has been in existence in Europe and successfully in Europe and in Southeast Asia for that matter for a while. So the technology is there and has been there. So in the United States, really probably going back to like the 2010, 2011, there was a project called Cape Wind that was proposed off the Massachusetts coast. That was really going to be the first offshore wind, nearly utility scale kind of project that was out there. At that point, the permitting mechanisms were not well worked out in the United States to support that. It was still kind of a patchwork of both federal and state agency oversight. So there were challenges in getting a project like that approved from a permitting perspective. Some other things that kind of happened with that project back in those days, that offshore wind project in particular was relatively close to the shore. So relatively close to well-heeled beach communities in New England with strong political connections that might not want to have their property values impacted by close proximity of fairly large turbines out in the ocean, was kind of an underlay to the whole thing. So really, as a result of the combination of those factors, right? Supply chain wasn't there, the permitting mechanisms weren't really in place. There was political opposition and pretty high-ranking political opposition to the project. And ultimately, it failed as a result of that. So a fair amount of investment was made. Most of the offshore wind development community sort of looked at that, raised their eyes, and kind of took well, right now, this is not the right time to come in and try to invent a wheel when a wheel just fell apart. So offshore wind kind of went into a latency period for a few years in the United States. Didn't really ever go away. There's always been a lot of interest, and almost on every coast, there's always people that are floating, no pun intended, floating these ideas of wind projects. And some of them get some legs, and there's been many of them over time. 2015, 2016, the federal government kind of reorganized how they administer the outer continental shelf. It became under the purview, or it was under the purview now of BOEM, the Bureau of Offshore Energy Management. They developed strong guidance for developing offshore wind in the United States. That was all kind of politically inspired. That was, part of the clean energy agenda. And so it really started to get some legs, started to get some structure around it. There was a process that was defined, and they took on the proactively leasing pieces of the seafloor in areas that, that there was interest in developing offshore wind energy, and the resource was good, which is really most of the northeastern United States. New England in particular is where really the first activity started to happen. That really kicked things off into what we see now. So a lot of the projects that now that are in the queue really were conceptualized in these very early days. I guess it's 8 years ago, but it seems like an eternity ago. But yeah, about 8 years ago. So that process became defined, much better defined. Permitting process was defined. There are a lot of things that were getting worked out along the way, but ultimately, I think that de-risked the market to the point where now foreign investors who had offshore wind farms, so a number of our big clients, from Europe, started looking at the East Coast. Some of the early entrants were like Ørsted, Equinor. A lot of these were oil and gas majors who were trying to change their portfolio to include much more clean energy and to decarbonize. So it was a good opportunity as all those things came together, and that's where the market started to kind of really develop. From there, the states that were inshore of those facilities started developing their own policies for procuring clean energy. So it was really good, a very timely marriage. There was an appetite for clean electrons. The states in these regions started putting out legislative goals for procurement of clean energy, in specific from offshore wind development. And so now you had the demand end and you had the supply end kind of coming together. Power purchase agreements started to come from that. And so the early projects started to, they eventually, as those projects were developing, the state started putting out procurement programs for buying that energy. It happens to be in the northeastern US. There's a massive demand for energy to begin with. So it was a really good location for that. And so it really came together at that point. And so now some of the projects that were from those early days, like Vineyard One, there's steel in the water, there's a turbine spinning right now. So now that took a while, probably took honestly, more than 7 years if you really think about it, from concept to there's a turbine out there generating electricity now. That was, that project is really out of those early days. So that's sort of the history that kind of takes us to the environment that we sit in right now. So BOEM has been putting out really on almost every 6 to 9 months new lease areas. They had additional leases along the Atlantic coast, not just in New England, but they opened some up in New Jersey. Then another tranche of leases kind of came out in New England. Another tranche of leases came out in New Jersey. So there's I'm going to guess, but more than 20 lease areas off the, mid-Atlantic and New England coast. Off the coast of Virginia, there's a lease area that's being developed by Dominion. Off the coast of North Carolina, there's a lease area, and even off the coast of South Carolina now, there are some lease areas that have been auctioned off and they have been bought. Same in California. This past year, there were 5 lease areas in California, which will be a different technology, but we can get into that a little bit later because that'll be floating wind, not fixed bottom. So yeah, so that has kind of grown into really, a regular procurement schedule or a regular auction schedule where, energy companies are procuring those leases and starting to develop their project. And, now, I'm working on all 3 coasts in the Gulf. I'm working up in California and on the Atlantic coast. And there's a lot of activity happening. Yeah, so that's where we are.
Dane, that's a really good overview. Now, I just have like a fact question. When it comes down to offshore, how far offshore are these farms located?
So the early day leases, so they're, are generally the closest of those turbines can be as close as 12 miles offshore. Really 12, I think 12 is the closest, and it's really, I think there are 2 New Jersey projects that, like, the first turbine that's about where it is, 12 to 13, maybe 14 miles. And then it's deeper than that. Then it's further out from there, but that's the closest that, a turbine would be to the coast. Most of the new leases that have come out more recently are well over 20 miles off the coast. So it's, as the technology to do fixed bottom has gotten better, it's become much more feasible to put them further, which helps deal with some of the issues that we talked about that kind of almost squashed offshore wind in the beginning.
NIMBY is the acronym that we hear often, not in my backyard. And I think that's really funny because I had never asked the question how far offshore these are, but we just got back from the Texas Gulf Coast, and there are offshore platforms everywhere along the beach, less than, 2 miles close enough to the beach. I think it's really funny that people are complaining about 12 miles.
It sort of depends on what you're socialized to. So in the Texas, Louisiana coast, where it has a legacy of, oil and gas development, and you've just become used to that. You also don't really hear people talking so much about going to Louisiana and Texas beaches, probably because of that, right? So you look at New Jersey, Long Island, Cape Cod, the Delaware, Virginia beaches that are very reliant on tourism. They're very expensive communities to live in generally. House values are pretty high, and people are very aware of what's going on. So living in New Jersey, I hear it a lot because, I live 30 minutes from the beach. So there's a lot of concern about the proximity of the wind farms to the beach and what people will see. There's a lot of work, a lot of technical work that gets put out by visual planners, visual assessment experts. I work with a firm that has some of the foremost people. They do photorealization work. Yeah, you will see wind turbines from the closest leases. The ones that are like more than 20, 24 miles, you're not going to see those. Just not. The curvature of the earth makes it so that you're not going to see those. But these are tall. Turbines are tall.
How fast are those blades spinning at optimal speed or at like full out speed, I should say, not optimal?
It's really deceptive because it doesn't look like they're spinning that fast from the shore, right? So you kind of think of it, maybe on a good day, that would be kind of sort of what I'm probably too fast to be honest. And I've seen them actually. There's a project off the coast of Virginia that I've gone and visited 35 miles or so out at sea. You can't see it until you're probably on the water on a boat 15 miles away on an average day because there's always ocean haze and things like that. But I've got some really cool pictures. You're watching it spin. You're kind of standing under it at the tip of the blade. I think someone told me it's upwards of 300 miles an hour. That blade, that wind tip, is actually moving through the space.
I would not have guessed that at all.
Right. That is an uninformed guess of what someone told me. So I'll preface that by saying someone told me and not actually looked at it, but you can hear it. I mean, you can hear it. We were under it on a boat, and it's a very gentle kind of whisking sound. And when it comes through, it's deceptive. I think the point that I took away from it is deceptively fast because it's not like a kid's pinwheel where it's whizzing around, but it is definitely moving at a clip.
Okay, so when you just introduced the market of where it currently is, you had a much more positive spin than where it's been being projected in the media of where it currently is. Because let's talk about the Gulf Coast leases for a second there, but
Sure.
continue to help me. Like, it's good to hear that we're having progress in the area. We're still continuing to pursue, but let's talk about some of the major holdups and why some of these projects are getting canceled
Yeah.
after we discuss the Gulf Coast, please.
And let's talk about the word you're using, canceled, because I think it's important that we understand what we're actually saying. So only one project has actually been canceled. Some of the power purchase agreements have been canceled, but not the projects themselves. So I'll get into that a little bit. So talking about the Gulf of Mexico. Gulf of Mexico is a different place because the drivers for offshore wind are different. So the drivers for offshore wind development in the Northeast and in California are primarily electric grid driven. They're driven by the demand for more clean electrons in the electrical grid. You've got huge load centers, huge demand for energy, and societally, we're trying to make that more green. So the demand for offshore wind into these communities is to feed electrons for grid usage. In Texas and Louisiana in particular, it's a different story because Texas is well served by renewable energy. Oddly, probably counterintuitively to a lot of the audience, Texas is the #1 user and producer of renewable energy in the country. Like, people don't think of Texas that way. I told my wife one day, and she was like, "No, you're lying. You're just talking out your butt again." And I'm like, "No, this is actually true." A lot of offshore, a lot of onshore wind, a lot of solar in Texas. So there's a lot of competition for clean electrons and a lot of provision for clean electrons in Texas. So the demand for offshore wind, which is still a more expensive form of clean electrons than onshore wind and onshore solar, the demand is different, right? So your rate base and your user base has to be willing to pay a little bit more for that. Same story in Louisiana, and Louisiana is different yet than Texas. I think tolerance for paying a higher price for electricity so that it can be green is much lower. There's much lower capacity in Louisiana to be able to do that. Not just desire, but actual physical capacity for the rate base to pay more for clean energy, which is a different story than in the Northeast and in California. So in Louisiana and Texas, your demand for offtake has to come probably from something other than the grid. And that's really going to be industry. So as industry is trying to decarbonize, that's really going to be where the demand for clean electrons come from. So what was very interesting this summer, I think it was this past summer, BOEM leased 2 lease areas off the coast of Texas and 1 lease area off the coast of Louisiana near Lake Charles. for offshore wind development. And perhaps not surprisingly, there is very little interest in bidding on those. So nobody bid on the two Texas leases. There was one bidder for the Louisiana lease area, and they essentially got that lease area at the minimum bid. So I always think that I should have gotten 10 friends together and maybe we could have got ourselves, an offshore wind lease, but did not have that foresight.
You and your band could have bought that lease, man.
We're obviously operating at that level. So yeah, so what was very interesting about that is the market kind of, I guess, coming up to that. I was actually at a Power to X conference and I was on a panel and it was in Houston, and the panel was experts on green hydrogen and how that kind of feeds into green ammonia and the industrial base. And it was actually a fairly bleak picture from the economic side, in terms of looking at the economic case to be made for making clean chemicals from offshore wind when you have other sources of clean electrons. So that was kind of the first moment where I started to get, I started, we on the side in the industry, we all kind of like to speculate and almost do a pool on what do you think the lease areas are going to go for? And I started at that point kind of bringing my estimates down, nowhere near as low as they went. I didn't expect that there'd be that little interest. There were a couple of clients and companies that I'm friends with that were at that event, and I think at a dinner we were chatting a little bit and started to hear many of the developers that I thought were not in. They were not bidding at all. And so that result came to pass where there was only one lease awarded and the other ones weren't even bid on. The other two in Texas weren't even bid on. So I think that really started to underscore there's a demand element to this. There has to be a demand side element to this. And until that gets solved, there isn't an economic case for a developer to profitably build a very expensive offshore wind farm when you don't really have the offtake for it. And you can't really guarantee to your stakeholders when they're going to start to see a return on investment. This is just life. So it's a different story in the Northeast and in California, though, because you do have that grid demand.
Dane, you began speaking about what the concept of Power to X is. Go ahead and elaborate further on it.
Yeah, so that is basically providing green electrons to industrial users. So, companies that use an awful lot of fossil energy as part of their process to either manufacture or operate or do both of those things. The idea of Power to X is really to provide clean electrons to a number of user facilities, hence the X, that they can begin to decarbonize by providing them with clean electrons to do that. So offshore wind is one potential source of those, but there's lots of other sources of those.
Yeah, sustainable aviation fuels, hydrogen, ammonia. I kind of see Power to X as from power to chemicals or fuels is kind of how or even a storage of electricity into a different form.
Right. For the end use of an industrial operator of some kind.
So let's talk about that further. When it comes down to industrial use and having the offtake, how many megawatts does a typical offshore wind farm, or gigawatts even, does an offshore wind farm produce? How about this? Let's get even more nitty gritty. How many megawatts should we expect from a general turbine you were just talking about?
Yeah, so right now, those are being built at about 15 megawatts per turbine.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's ever increasing. There are manufacturers that keep upping that number because it's more economically viable the larger that one single unit can generate electricity. So we've seen the turbines really increase from, in the early days, they were maybe 6 megawatt turbines to now they're 15 megawatt turbines. And there's 18s and there's 20s there's 18s on the market in Southeast in China. I know China's working on even bigger ones. So I think I saw 20. I was just reading an article the other day about a 20 megawatt, turbine. So they keep trying to push that harder, which, while good, is also not good because now you get the supply chain issues, and and how do you manufacture? You keep changing what you're going to manufacture, and everything has to retool to support that. So that adds some complexity in the market too, in terms of like lack of standardization makes everything more expensive. So there's a counterbalance that has to be worked out along the way.
So I
But
remember.
your average wind farm, right now, your average project is probably 1.2 gigawatts. So, 120, 100 or so, turbines out there, each generating at 15. We're really looking at 1.2 gigawatts, 1,200 megawatts.
So we started to talk about, some of the issues with standardization. I kind of remember onshore wind going through this interesting, like they were trying to make everything bigger too fast. And it's almost they encountered like design maturity issues to where they were creating these designs that just weren't mature enough. There was a lot of failures and parts. So I was trying to think of how positively it might impact that, like the slow of offshore wind here in the United States, because we're utilizing like the North Sea and other parts globally as a time to like firm up and mature the designs that do work and then implementing here in the United States. So I'm trying to see
Yeah,
that as like
that's
a
exactly
positive.
that's exactly what's happening. So, I mean, while maybe frustrating for a lot of people how slow the development process is, it's actually good. For example, some of those earlier projects had to go back into federal agencies to kind of reopen the permitting process, because now all of a sudden there's larger turbines on the market, which makes those projects more financially viable. And the industry is learning what works, what doesn't work, because it is slower, because we are getting to watch what works in other parts of the world in similar and then in dissimilar environments. So yeah, so from that perspective, most utility scale offshore wind farms have more or less settled right now in the 15 megawatt kind of model that is out there. Couple of manufacturers of those who have built the equipment or building the equipment. They've built they built the supply chain to build that equipment. So there seems to have been a little more standardization than if you look at the early days, especially of onshore wind, where it was very loosey-goosey, right? And you see a lot of pictures of turbines failing that the press likes to put in front of people, which are old designs, unproven designs, built in haste. So that is less of an issue that we're seeing in this market. Again, Europe and Southeast Asia are really the test case for building these. And we've got some demonstration projects in the US. There's the Block Island wind farm, which is 5 turbines, 5 small turbines. I think they're 2 megawatts each. And then there's 2 that are spinning off the coast of Virginia for Dominion. That's their Central Virginia offshore wind demonstration project. So they're gathering tons of data on those. They've been gathering data on those. So we're taking the non-US models, kind of calibrating them for the conditions that we've witnessed and seen here over the years, and what they're building now kind of incorporates all of that.
Do we currently have any active floating offshore wind?
We do not at real scale. So I believe that there has been a demonstration of kind of a model version of a floating wind platform, like very, very scaled down. But that's it. Right now in the US, there is no floating, either demonstration or actual. There is a demonstration project that is under development in the state waters in California off of Vandenberg Air Force Base. That will probably be the first one that is built, and that will be a demonstration project of floating turbines. That'll be the first in the US. In Europe, there are actually floating utility scale, and it's new, very recent. I think in Scotland, there's a new farm that it just went operational. I know there's a project off the coast of Portugal. Not sure if that was utility scale or a demonstration scale project, but yeah, so they are being built. The technology to build those is there, but it hasn't been really deployed at a utility scale yet. anywhere other than I think this one project in Scotland, and that just happened. So it's still in development.
I want to come back to this. I want to come full circle to talk about transferable skills because we are professionals when it comes down to floating offshore oil recovery. So I'm going
Mhm.
to come back to that. But a question I have now is let's talk about some of the economics. How much does it cost to build some of these offshore wind facilities or
Oof.
farms?
That is probably something I should know, but I don't know off the top of my head.
I
It's
don't
easy.
blame you because of
Yeah,
how much flux it goes from like different geographical locations. Like I don't blame you on not knowing this. I was just hoping
yeah.
you had
I,
maybe
I
like a
think I think it. I
shot in
mean,
the dark.
yeah. I think it's in the hundreds of millions to billions of dollars. It's significant, right? So I mean, just there is the investigation work. There is, I mean, actually, we have people in the company that I probably should ask, but yeah, but yeah, I mean, it's in the hundreds of millions to billions of dollars to build one of these, a
I
farm.
don't I don't blame you. I know you're in that early phase, the feasibility
Yeah,
phases and making it happen. Okay, so let's go into that talk of like transferable skill sets because what I'm seeing right now, like as we were talking about this floating offshore wind, I'm thinking, we have amazing experts doing offshore oil recovery that have built platform designs that can withstand the most difficult sea conditions that you can possibly think of. Obviously, a turbine is going to be much taller and going to take a totally different design, but how cool is that to inspire if we do ever achieve peak oil, where we start to taper from actually going out and obtaining oil, to have those engineers and those types of skill sets that are transferable? Like, what are some other skill sets that you see being transferable for current conventional energy folks into this new realm of offshore wind?
yeah. There's so much, right? So I mean, most of the components for the Vineyard One project, a lot of the material is actually being built on the Gulf Coast and shipped up here because the infrastructure to build pilings, the shipping, all of that all exists in the Gulf as a result of all the oil and gas development. So to me, these aren't mutually exclusive concepts. I mean, we need both forms of energy. And I think, we want to do the very kind of slow, modification where we're getting more and more of our electrons and energy from clean sources. But there's there's the ports, there's the shipping, there's all the support, all the supply chain, building big structures, that exists in both markets. You can go even earlier, like the investigation stuff. So the stuff that we do in my market, I'm part of the National Association of Environmental Professionals, and we started an offshore wind environmental professionals group because for this exact reason, all of the technical skills of biology, all the ology types of scientific skills that one would need to deploy to look at what are the impacts of offshore oil and gas infrastructure are exactly the same questions we have to ask and answer as it relates to offshore wind. So so all those skills are directly transferable. So from your white collar types of jobs all the way through the delivery chain, some of the biggest parties engaged in our market right now are carpenters. Like the carpenters union is massively engaged because there is so much work that they see that involves the carpenters union, pipe fitters. So it's very directly transferable. You're just building a different thing with the skills that you already have developed building this one other thing. So there's tons of opportunity. There's tons of things that are coming, and actually are all not just coming. It's fair to say they're already happening. Like I said, a lot of the infrastructure that is being put in for the Vineyard One project is being built in the Gulf Coast and being shipped up. So yeah, a lot.
So, Dane, I think that's a really good positive note to kind of wrap up our conversation because if we got any deeper, I think that it wouldn't be considered elemental anymore. And this is a great overview of
Right.
offshore wind in the United States.
I did want to go back and touch on, where we are in the market right now and some of the negative press that you're hearing about offshore wind, because I don't think we touched on that. I think I painted a story that got us to where we are. Part of that story is a lot of these early projects obtain their power purchase agreements before the current economic conditions went into place, post-COVID, post the war in Ukraine. Ukraine's a massive provider of steel into the market. So all of a sudden you have some very, very large disruptive market events that when a lot of these wind farms procured and agreed on a price for developing their electrons into the grid, those conditions have changed. And those projects are simply, in today's economics, at those price points are simply not viable. And a company has to do the responsible thing by its stakeholders and not commit to losing money. So much so that two of them have canceled their power purchase agreements for fines of $50-60 million. So it kind of tells you how much money they would have lost if they were willing to pay, between $40 and $60 million to get out of a commitment if they would have stayed in that commitment. So when you're hearing about project cancellations, what you're mostly hearing about are cancellations or, companies pulling out of power purchase agreements. One of the ways that the states, so there's a game a little bit, the state has to procure power the right way, transparently in front of its ratepayers for that electricity. So while I think states understand the reality, they're kind of bound by their agreement. They can't just change the rules or just change the price. So they really have to hold to that. But what the states have done, recognizing that this is the market conditions right now, they sped up their schedule of putting out solicitations. They've put out additional new solicitations. So when these developers are backing out of those power purchase agreements, they can rebid on the next round. So it's delaying the projects. It's pushing those to the right, is what we say in the industry. It's not canceling those projects, but those projects are going to bid at a profitable margin. And if there's tolerance in the rate base to buy that at an additional cost, then that's going to happen. So we're already seeing that happen. There already have been new power purchase agreements at higher prices for a lot of the new leases in the New York Bight, for example. So the rate base, at least in New Jersey, New York, is tolerant enough. They want green energy enough that they're willing to pay the equivalent of, maybe $2.40 more a month on their electric bill to support that. That will be different in different parts of the country, depending on where you are and what the political tolerance is and the economic tolerance for the population to afford that. So that's what you're hearing in the market, other than like a lot of the political noise as well. Because one party wants it, the other party has to be against it. And there's no nuance to that argument. So there's some of that going on in the background, but that's what is really happening in the market, is that the economic conditions for the supply chain that supports these projects has changed, and they can't operate profitably. And why would they? Why wouldn't they? So yeah, that's where we are.
Dane, I'm so grateful for your time, and walking away, I feel so much more positive about offshore wind, honestly. And I really appreciate you walking us through that to help us gain an understanding that it's still happening and it's still here. It just might be a little slower than some of us had anticipated. So, as always, everyone, I hope you stay happy, but most importantly, stay safe. Dane, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Marcia. Really great to talk to you.
I feel so much better about offshore wind after talking to Dane. It's really amazing what even somebody like myself who is in this market and who does support offshore wind, how easily we can be influenced by media and different headlines that we see. A lot of my news comes from, LinkedIn, and comes from me searching just general Google and news site presses for offshore wind releases. And so to see the title canceled, canceled, canceled over and over, it gave me a really bleak feeling about offshore wind. But after having that conversation with Dane and hearing that it's still a reality, it gives me a lot of hope for anybody who's in the environmental side, certainly, as well as all the skill sets that might be transferable in the future. It's kind of cool to think about the floating offshore wind and taking all of the platforms that are currently out there and redesigning something that can just be a little bit different to help decarbonize in a different way. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I want you to stick around because I have a real treat for you. After this outro, Dane provided me with his band's live recording. So I hope you enjoy listening to Making Wind.